everyone. Thanks for joining our live webinar. Today's presentation covers mobile programming using Xamarin.Forms. My name is Lindsay Locke. I'm Pluralsight's Webinar Program Manager. I'll be your host today, and I'm here if you have any questions about the webinar recording, future webinar topics, or anything related to the presentation interface. I'm happy to introduce our presenter and host today, Jesse Liberty. Jesse is a software developer, consultant, and Pluralsight author specializing in Azure, mobile, and web development. He hosts the popular Yet Another podcast and has written 24 best-selling books. Thanks for joining us today, Jesse. We're happy to have you. We'll be watching Jesse's presentation, including some video demos on Xamarin.Forms, and at the end of his demo, Jesse will be able to take your questions. So please submit your questions using the chat box on your screen. In addition to that, we are recording everything today, and we'll publish the recording to our website in just a few days. Let's do a quick audio check and make sure everyone has their speakers turned on. The sound for today's presentation should come from your computer speakers. Please try refreshing your browser, logging out, and joining again if you lose sound or have any buffering issues. In addition to the chat box and the presentation window, which you can maximize if you want to see the screen larger, there are a number of helpful downloads to the left of your screen, including links to Jesse's courses. You can learn more about our presenter, and you can tweet at us directly with the social widget at the bottom of your screen. And one final thing, before you leave, a survey should pop up. It's super short, and we'd love to hear from you, so please give us your feedback. And with that, I'm going to hand everything over to Jesse. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, this is Jesse Liberty. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a Xamarin MVP, and a certified Xamarin developer. This webinar is building your first mobile application with Xamarin.Forms, and it's based on my Pluralsight course, Building Your First Mobile Application with Xamarin.Forms and Visual Studio 2017. That's currently available on Pluralsight, and we'll take the material that we're going to look at in this webinar and go into far greater depth. But let's take a quick look, an overview of Xamarin.Forms, why you might want to use them, and some of their features. In traditional mobile development, iOS, Android, and Windows were each written with different development languages, using different IDEs. There was no shared code, and you needed to know 3 different languages and 3 different development environments. Typically, this was done by having multiple teams. With Xamarin native applications, all 3 platforms are written with C#, and thus you're able to share that entire code base. You get 100% native API access. As far as the phone is concerned, there's absolutely no difference between a Xamarin native application and a native application, so you get all the performance that you would expect. However, in this Xamarin native approach, you do have to write the UI separately for iOS, Android, and Windows. With Xamarin.Forms, on the other hand, not only do you share all of the logic written in C#, but you share the entire user interface code, giving you 100% reuse across all 3 platforms. Now, let me put in a caveat. There are times that you will create special platform-specific user interface, and so that 100% might drop down to 95%. But you can see there's a tremendous reuse by using Xamarin.Forms. Let me emphasize that whether you use Xamarin Native or Xamarin.Forms, what's produced is 100% native code. So on iOS, the output is going to be indistinguishable from what you would have written using Objective-C. And similarly, with the Android part of Xamarin.Forms, the output will be indistinguishable from what you would have written in Java. Just as Xamarin allows you to share the code base among iOS, Android, and Windows, Xamarin.Forms allows you to share the user interface, and what is produced is indistinguishable from what you would produce in the native environment. Xamarin.Forms provides support for more than just shared logic and shared user interfaces, but is really a complete development framework for building mobile applications. Let's start with the UI. Currently there are over 40 pages, layouts, and controls. We'll take a look at some of these, but remember that the number is always growing with each new release. In addition to the user interface, however, Xamarin.Forms provides support for two-way data binding, and we'll take a look at what this means. It also provides support for navigation among pages and passing data from one to the other. There is a complete animation API for 2D animation, and there is a dependency service for lightweight dependency injection. Finally, there is also a messaging center, and when we talk about MVVM, you'll see that you can use the messaging center to send messages from a view model to its view, or between any two other objects. Let's start by talking about some of the layout controls. These are used to hold other layout controls and the controls themselves. The first one we want to talk about is the content presenter, which makes a great outermost layout control. The content view is typically used within another layout control and helps you divide up your presentation. As you might imagine, the scroll view is great when you have more data or more controls to show on a page than you have room for. This allows you to scroll up and down and is very common in mobile applications. The frame is used less commonly these days, but does give you the ability to create what amount to boxes or cards around each entry in a list. The templated view may be the most powerful layout control in the entire Xamarin.Forms toolbox. The templated view allows you to determine a custom presentation for each object in a list, and we're going to take a look at this in some depth as we go. The stack layout is surprisingly popular. It allows you to stack one object on top of another or objects side by side. The absolute layout is used sparingly, but it does allow you to position a control at a very specific location on the page. More common is the relative layout, which allows you to specify the position of controls relative to each other. Another very popular and very powerful layout is the grid layout. This works very much like tables do in HTML. In Xamarin.Forms, what we call controls are also called views. One of the views is a simple activity indicator, sometimes called a spinner, that indicates that something is happening with your app, so the user doesn't think that it's hung. There's a box view that simply draws a box on the page. This can be useful for layout, and it can also be useful during the initial description of the page to get your placement proper. The button control, as you might expect, can be clicked and cause various actions under program control. The date picker is one of many pickers. There's also a time picker and a general picker. We'll talk about pickers. An editor allows multi-line entry. And not to be confused with it, is the entry control that allows a single line of text to be entered. There is an image control, which, as you might expect, is used to display JPEGs and PNGs, and these can be loaded either locally or over the internet. There's a label control for displaying text, and this is often used in conjunction with other views. One of the most powerful views is the list view, which allows you to display the individual contents of a collection one after the other. And we'll spend some time with the list view. There's an OpenGL view, as well as the various pickers that we talked about just a moment ago. And there's a progress bar that can be used to indicate how far along you are with a particular activity. Let's name just a few of the other controls. There's a search bar, which you can place at the top of your page and use for incremental or complete searches. There's a slider, and often you'll tie the slider to a label so that as you slide, the value of the slider can be displayed. There's a stepper control, as well as a switch control. And once again, these switches are rendered as they would be on the native platform. There's a table view control, and there's a web view control. And the web view control can be used to display anything that you would display in a browser. You can create your views using C#, but virtually no one does. Instead, we use XAML. XAML is a markup language that is very much like XML or HTML. You may be familiar with XAML from its use in WPF or in Silverlight. If you've not seen XAML at all, you may want to take a look at my Pluralsight course, XAML for Xamarin.Forms. In any case, it's easy to pick up. Here we see the XAML for an entry control, and it has 3 placeholders: the name, how this should be laid out horizontally, and there's a placeholder. Placeholders provide text that disappears as soon as the user begins to enter their own text. Programmers hate to reinvent the wheel, and so once an approach has been worked out, it's captured in a pattern. The absolute key pattern for Xamarin.Forms is MVVM, which stands for Model, View, View Model. This pattern was created at Microsoft with the creation of WPF and Silverlight. To simplify the pattern, or at least the essence of the pattern, the model is your data. The view is your page, that is the display of your data. And all of the logic of your application goes into the view model. One of the very most powerful features of Xamarin.Forms is data binding. With data binding, you can make an automatic connection between a view and its data. This allows you to display the data in the view without explicitly writing any code to do so. When using the MVVM pattern and data binding, we bind the value of a control to a public property in the view model. This is a critical concept and worth repeating. The value of the control is bound to a public property in the view model. Here we see the entry that we saw earlier with 2 new lines, a style ID, which we'll come back to later, and the text, instead of being set to specific text, is bound to new project name. New project name is going to be a public property in the view model. And so Xamarin.Forms is going to reach into the view model, find the public property new project name, and take its value and use that to set the text in the entry. So far we've talked about reaching into the view model and getting a public property to set, for example, the text of an entry. However, the user might enter text into the entry, and we would like that public property in the view model to be updated. To do so, we set the mode of the binding to two-way. If the view is bound, for example, to a public property in the view model, and the value in that property changes, the view needs to be notified. To do this, the view model implements iNotifyPropertyChanged. The interface iNotifyPropertyChanged requires an event and a method. The event is of type PropertyChangedEventHandler, which is defined by Xamarin.Forms. The method raisEPropertyChanged takes as a parameter the name of the property. It then checks to see if the event is null. If it's not null, then someone has registered to be notified when this event is raised, and so we raise the event, passing in a reference to the current object and a PropertyChangedEventArgs object. That PropertyChangedEventArgs is usually empty, but may contain information valuable to the view. Any page can create a resource dictionary. Resources are reusable bits of XAML. For example, here we see a resource dictionary that has two layout options. All resources are key value pairs. The key for the first is horizontal, and its value is that the alignment is start. A horizontal with a value of start means all the way on the left. The second layout option we have here is vertical, and its alignment is center. And you can have many more resources below that. Resources can go at the top of your XAML page and will apply to that page, or you can create a set of global resources that apply to every page. You use a resource by setting it as a parameter to a view in XAML. For example, here we have a label whose text is Demonstrate Resources. Now we want to set its horizontal options, and we want to use the resource whose key is horizontal. We do so using the keyword static resource and then the key horizontal, and we put all of that in curly braces. Another kind of resource that can go in your resource dictionary is a style. A style is assigned a key. It's also assigned a target type, which tells the style what kind of view it can be applied to. Each style consists of one or more setters, and each setter consists of a property and a value. Here we're setting the property to be the horizontal options and the value to be center in the first, and in this case only, setter of the first, and in this case only, style. But of course you could have multiple styles with multiple setters. Once you've defined your style, you can use it in a view, as you see here. You set the style equal to, and once again we use static resource, and the name, that is the key for the style, and all of that is contained within curly braces. Let's look at how you define some views in XAML. Perhaps one of the simplest is the label, and the only thing required in a label is that you set its text. You can also set its text through data binding, and of course there are other parameters you can set, such as its horizontal and vertical layout. Before we examine the button, we need to understand code behind versus view model. Every XAML page has attached to it a code behind page. If you have, for example, a page named page 1, you will have associated with it page1.cs. You can put event handlers into that code behind. Here we have a button, and notice it has a clicked event, and what is assigned to the clicked event is a method called handleClicked. If we make this kind of assignment, then handleClicked will be in the code behind. This will work, but it's not exactly what we want because it violates the MVVM pattern. We typically want all of our event handlers and nearly all of our logic to be out of the code behind and into the view model. To accomplish moving the event handler out of the code behind and into the view model, the button has the option of a command. A command says, when this event, in this case the clicked event, is raised, bind that to a method in the view model, in this case the add command. When the button is clicked, that method, add command, will be triggered in the view model. Here we come back to the entry. We set its name, we bind its text using two-way binding, set its horizontal options, and also set a placeholder, which once again will be replaced by text once the user begins to enter text. And when that text is entered and the user leaves the entry, the property in the view model will be updated. Now we come to the list view. Again, one of the most powerful controls there are. We're going to look at the list view in detail when we get to the demo. But for now, let's look at a basic list view. Here we have a name, and then we have the item's source property. That says, here is the collection of items that we want to display. That collection will be a public property in our view model, and we're going to bind to that collection to set the item source. Next, we need to decide how each member of that collection will be displayed. In this case, we'll use an item template, which will be used to stamp out each item identically. That is, the item template tells the list, here's how to display each item in the collection. That's followed by the data template, or more accurately, the data template is within the item template, and within the data template are various kinds of cells. In this case, we're using a simple text cell, which is used to display text, and the text that we're displaying is bound to the property name. To go over that again quickly, the list view gets its collection from the item's source. In this case, that's bound to a collection called projects, which will be found in the view model. And then each object in the collection will be displayed according to the item template. The item template has a data template. The data template can have one or more views. In this case, we have only one, the text cell, which will display the property value name from the view model in the text cell for each item in the collection. Here are a few very simple rules about using a layout. Each page can have exactly one control or layout. That would be a debilitating restriction, except that layouts can contain other layouts and controls. And so you simply create an outermost layout and put everything within it. The most common layouts to use are the stack layout and the grid, although as we saw, there are a number of other alternative layouts. There are a couple interesting features of the stack layout, in addition to the fact that they can stack one object above another or one object next to another, which is set by the orientation property. They can also provide padding between the objects within the stack layout and margins around the entire stack layout. Stack layouts, of course, like other layouts, can contain other layouts, including other stack layouts, so you can create fairly complex structures. The grid is a very powerful control. The first thing that you do in a grid is set the row and column definitions. Here we're setting the row definitions first. There are a number of ways to set the height of each row. One way is relative, using star values. So notice the first two have 2 star and 1 star. And that says divide the entire row into thirds, and for the first row give it 2/3, and for the second row give it 1/3. However, our third row definition has a height set to a specific value of 200. What will happen here is that the row will assign 200 to that third row, and then it will take the remaining space and divide it 2 to 1. In the column definitions, we've set the width to auto, which essentially says for the first column, make it big enough to hold whatever I put in it, and then for the second column, make it as wide as all the remaining space. Below the row and column definitions, we put our views, and here we have only one. The text is second row, first column, and we're in fact going to place this in the second row, first column. Remember that columns and rows are zero-based. So if we want to place this label in the second row, we use grid.row equal 1. And similarly, to put it in the first column, we use grid.column equal 0. We can use this kind of assignment, grid.row and grid.column, with any kind of view. As I mentioned, programmers hate to reinvent the wheel. And one of the greatest features in Xamarin.Forms is the advent of plugins. Plugins make your life incredibly simple because they handle tasks that might otherwise need to be specific to each platform. You just download a plugin, add it to your application, and it simply works. They encapsulate all of the code across all of the platforms. Many of the plugins are written by Xamarin, notably by James Montemagno, but many of the plugins are also written by the community. In any case, you get all of the plugins through NuGet, and there are a lot of plugins out there, and these can make creating your application far simpler because you do not have to figure out how to do all of this natively. You can simply add the plugin and then call its API. Dependency injection is a very powerful technique that is somewhat beyond the scope of this webinar. But it is worth noting that Xamarin.Forms has DI built in, and this is used primarily when invoking platform-specific code, most notably when using SQLite. I do go into this in more detail, in a good bit more detail, in my course. There are a number of advanced topics that we won't have time for today, but that are covered in the course. For example, there are data converters that allow you to take data in one form, such as a Boolean, and turn them into another form, such as a color. There are behaviors and event-to-command behaviors, which allow you to add commanding to any view. There's data storage, such as to the file system or to SQLite. There's use of the messaging system, and of course there's talking to the cloud. Other advanced topics that are covered in the course, but we won't have time for today, are effects that are used to modify how views are displayed, custom rendering that allows you to completely take over the logic and display of a view, and native control embedding, which allows you to take a native control from one of the platforms and embed it directly into your Xamarin.Forms application. Okay, let's start our demo with Visual Studio for Mac. You can, of course, use Visual Studio on Windows. I happen to be running on a Mac, so we'll go ahead and create a new project here. We're going to create a multi-platform application. There are two types of Xamarin.Forms application. The blank Forms application, which is what I will normally use, but it starts out with no support for you. You have to build all of your pages yourself. Or you can use the Forms app, which is a pre-created master detail application. This is a great launching point. You can use it, modify it, create your application with that as a starting point. And perhaps even more important, you can use it as an excellent learning tool. It demonstrates how to do many things in Xamarin.Forms and uses best practices. Let's go ahead and use that. We're going to name that My To-Do List. You don't have to build a to-do list, but that's what we're getting out of the box. So we might as well just leave it as a to-do list. We can build Android and/or iOS. We can also build a back-end ASP.NET Core Web API project. Normally I would do this, but for now we won't. You have the option to change the project and solution name. You have the option, which I use, to put this project in its own directory. And you have the option to use Git for version control. We'll go ahead and do that. It'll create a local repository for us. We won't really be using Git in this demo, but it's a good practice. We'll click Create. Visual Studio creates 3 projects for us. The first one, My To-Do List, is a portable class library, often called a PCL. The second is the Android project, and the third is the iOS project. When you're working in Forms, most of your time is spent in the PCL. You do very little work in the platform-specific projects. Let's go ahead and run this in the simulator. Your first decision is which platform you want to run on, iOS or Android. We'll choose iOS. Then do you want to run debug or release, and then what simulator do you want to use? You can, of course, use a physical phone. I'm going to go ahead and use a simulator, and I'll use the iPhone 7 simulator with the latest version of iOS. It's going to build, and then it's going to bring up the simulator. The first thing to notice about this application is that the first page has a list view, but that list view is populated right now by mock data. That's a way to see data while we're working on the development and then later connect that to back-end data. This is a master detail, so if we click on an item, it takes us to the detail about that item. We can go back, click on Add, and normally here we would have entries. There are in fact entry views, but they're pre-filled, and that's because these are data bound to the mock data. Normally the field would be empty, and then when you save it, that would bind the new data to the properties behind. Let's go back to the Browse page, and the next page we want to look at is the Info page. And here we have a logo and a label with some data and a button that says Learn More. Let's click on that button, and that will take us to a web view. The web view works very much like a browser. Here it's been hard-coded to Xamarin.com, but notice we also have buttons for sharing and other buttons that you would associate with the browser. This is a completely interactive web view, and we can go back to the previous page, click on Browse, and we're back where we started. which is a great place to stop running and take a look. As we expect, we've got the three projects. My to-do list is the PCL project. We've also got the Android and iOS project. Let's open up the model and look at item. This is our object that we'll be working with. It has three properties: ID, text, and description. If we go to the views and the items page, there's quite a bit to see here. This has got the list view that lists all those items. Let's come back to this and look at something a little simpler, such as the item detail page. Here you've got two labels. One is bound to the item's text property and the other is bound to the item's description property. And we saw those properties in the item itself. If we go to the view model for this detail page, all we're doing here is setting up the properties to be able to talk to the specific item that was clicked on in the list. And once again, in the item, we can see that we have those properties that we're binding to the text and the description. In the code behind for the item detail page, we see a number of interesting things. First of all, we see the initialize component on line 11. Then on line 13, we're hard coding our first item. On line 18, we're setting our view model to the item detail view model and passing in the item that we just hard-coded. And then on line 19, we're doing that all-important setting the binding context to the view model. And that means that things that are data-bound will be data-bound to properties in the view model. Let's go ahead and look at the view model again, and we see the properties that we'll be binding to, in this case just item, on line 5. All right, let's take a look at this complex list view. First thing to do is to scroll to the top. We see a number of namespaces and the title, and then we see the toolbar items, and we have just one toolbar item. The text is add, and it has an event handler, add item clicked. Because it's a straightforward event handler, it'll be in the code behind, but let's scroll down to the list view itself. Here we see that the item's source is bound to something called items. We expect that to be a collection in the view model. Let's go take a look. And sure enough, we have an observable collection of item called items on line 10, and that's going to be the item's source. That is, we're going to iterate through each item in that observable collection of item objects. Let's go back to the list view. We now know where it's getting its items. It's got a number of properties, such as that it has uneven rows, that its refresh command is going to be bound into the view model, where there's a method load items command, and there are a number of other things bound into the view model. In the code behind, we see that the view model is set up to be the binding context on line 14. There's our onItemSelected method on line 17. And what it's doing is getting the selected item and then pushing that to the item detail page on line 22. Let's go back to the list view, and the list view itself starts on line 25 where we have the item template, followed on line 26 by the data template, and then we see our view cell, and inside the view cell we have a stack layout that contains two labels. The first label is bound to the text property, and that's the text property of each item in turn as we iterate through that collection. And the second label, text, points to or binds to the description on each item, and we see that on line 36. Now let's take a quick look at the About page. This actually defines a grid, so we see the row definitions for that grid. And then the first thing that's in there is a stack layout, and that stack layout contains within it an image, and that's the logo. Next we have a scroll view, and that's on line 36, and that is set to grid row 1. We then have a stack layout with a number of labels using formatted text, and this is the text that we saw at the top of this page. And then we have our button, which is on line 96, and that's bound to the open web command, which will be a method in the view model that will open up our web browser. The new item page, as you will remember, has a toolbar item and then a stack layout, and in that stack layout are labels and entry fields. The first entry is on line 19, and you can see that it is bound to the item's text property. If we go to mainpage.cs, which is the entry point for this application, we can see that it points to the About page, which navigates to the About, it sets up the icons, and so forth. We've covered this extremely quickly because this is a webinar. In the course itself, we go through this in great detail, and we use more call-outs. All of these topics and more are covered in my course, Building Your First Mobile Application with Xamarin.Forms and Visual Studio 2017. You can reach me at jesseliberty.me or on Twitter at jesseliberty. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us and for attending and watching Jesse's demo. And Jesse, thank you so much for sharing the presentation and for sharing your demo with us as well. We're going to go ahead and pull up some of these awesome questions that are coming in. Everyone, please continue to submit your questions in the chat box that's on the left hand of your screen. And I'm going to go ahead, Jesse, and throw some of these questions at you if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Awesome. Okay. So I did have a question that came in here very early from one of our attendees, from Sandeep. I hope I'm saying that right. He asks, do I need a web application via C# or ASP.NET?
No, you don't need a web application at all. The idea of Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms is that you write your entire project in C#, and you write your user interface in Xamarin.Forms, you write that in XAML, and then what you have is a native mobile application. So there's no ASP.NET, there's no web application at all.
Awesome, great. Okay.
Now, of course, you're free, I should add that you're free to create an ASP.NET backend and then interact with that through REST using your mobile application as a front end.
Awesome, cool. So tons of questions coming in here. We're going to try and get to as many of these as possible. Do you have a quick, if you could give like a 10-second scope of what your course covers? I mean, obviously the webinar covers a lot about the depth of your course, but 10-second scope of your course?
Sure. It begins at the very beginning, setting up and creating your first application, and it runs through virtually every topic I could think of in Xamarin.Forms. So let me see if I can think off the top of my head. That's going to be everything through data binding and list views, and then it's going to go on to interacting with servers. It's going to have, you know what, why don't you ask me the next question, and meanwhile I will take a quick look at the table of contents, because that's probably the simplest way to do it.
Perfect. Okay, so we have a question that came in. How good is Xamarin for cross-platform development, iOS and Android, compared to other alternatives?
Well, for me, it's the cross-platform development platform of choice, and the reason for that is that what you end up with is a native application. So as far as the phone is concerned, the iOS app is running identically to an app that was written in Objective-C, and the Android app is running and indistinguishable from an app that was written in Java. So you get all the access to the API, and you get all of the performance that you would get if you wrote it natively, but you share your logic in C#, and using Xamarin.Forms you share your UI. So it's an extremely productive way of creating mobile apps. I can,
Great.
if you want, I can go back to the other question and quickly answer the question about what's covered.
Sure.
And so we cover, and this is just a partial list, but we cover all of the layouts and views. We talk about data binding. We talk about data binding in list views and building list views. Then we have a topic on advanced data that talks about data converters and behaviors and messaging. We talk about styling, creating styles, inheriting styles, implicit styles, dynamic styles. We talk about storing data either to disk or to SQLite. We talk about being online versus offline and detecting that and synchronizing databases with Azure. We talk about internationalization, and we talk about customization. Those are the major topics that are covered in the course.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And just a quick shout out to people that are asking, yes, this entire presentation is being recorded. We are going to share the recording with everyone. Give us a few days to put that up on our website and we'll send an email out. And please continue to submit your questions. If we don't get to everyone's questions here, you can throw those out to the Twitter universe and we'll try to get to some of those later, or some of your friends can help crowdsource the answers to them as well. So here, I've actually had a couple questions come in on this subject. What is the main difference between Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms and when to use each other?
Okay, we refer to Xamarin Native. That's when you're building an application where you're sharing your code between iOS and Android, but all of your UI is built independently. With Xamarin.Forms, your UI is shared as well. Now, a year ago, I would have said that if you're building a commercial app or an enterprise app, you want to use Xamarin Native. But at this point, a number of things have changed, and my recommendation is, unless you have an extremely good reason, my recommendation is to use Xamarin.Forms. And the reasons for that are, A, Xamarin.Forms have become much more stable, and B, there are many more controls. C is that there's access to native controls from within Xamarin.Forms, so there's now no downside there. And finally, you can build your application in Xamarin.Forms, and then if you decide to integrate that with a Xamarin native application, you can embed your Xamarin.Forms right into a native application. So I would say for 99% of applications, Xamarin.Forms is the way to go.
Great. Another question comes in, what level of C# knowledge is required to become a Xamarin developer?
That's a great question. The answer to that is that you need to be reasonably familiar with C#. I would venture that if you're doing a serious app, that you want to have at least an intermediate level knowledge of C#. You don't have to be a C# expert. You don't have to be certainly don't have to be a C# language lawyer, but you do want to be comfortable with C#. And if you're reading many of the examples, that will involve understanding things like lambda expressions and link queries. That's probably the highest level that you'll need to be concerned with.
Great, awesome. Do you have any recommendations for some good plugins for maps in Xamarin.Forms?
I'm sorry, for what in Xamarin.Forms?
For maps? I don't
Maps.
know if that's a typo in
Sure, there are plugins for maps. The thing that I would do would be to go to the plugins home page. I can get you that URL in a minute or two, and look through. There are so many plugins at this point, and so many of them are excellent, that I would go to that homepage, which you can get to by just Googling or Binging, if you prefer, Xamarin.Forms plugins. But let me see if I can get you that URL.
Okay, great. While Jesse is taking a look for that link, I'm going to make a plug here real quick. This September, we have our very first in-person user conference. It's in Salt Lake City, where Pluralsight's headquarters are located, and it's September 19th through the 21st. Pluralsight Live, and we are really stoked about this conference. I don't know if you've heard about it or not. We have been really excited about it. And I have a very special promo code for webinar attendees. It's PS Live 2017 WBNR. That will get you the lowest price possible that you can get to attend. I don't even know what the entire discount is. I believe it takes something like $500 off the original fee, but it will get you an access pass to come attend and meet all of the change makers and thought leaders, attend all the sessions. Check it out on our website. It's going to be really, really exceptional, and we'd love to have you all there. And then you can come share everything you've learned about Xamarin.Forms in person. So we hope to see everyone there. So while Jesse is looking for that, screenshot that promo code. Yep, we're ready for it. I have that when you're ready.
Okay, it's a little long. It's components.xamarin.com. And if you want to go directly to the plugins, it's components.xamarin.com/category equal plugins, plugins, and you'll know you're on the right page because it'll say add some awesome to your app. And notice that you'll want to notice that there's a menu that says order by. It starts with featured, and those are some of the new featured plugins. But if you change the menu to downloads or name, that'll give you a much longer list of plugins. It shows you if there's any charge. Almost all of them are free, and it shows you what operating system they work on. Almost all of them work on iOS, Android, and Windows.
Awesome. And if you need to hit Jesse up about that, check out his speaker bio on the right of your screen. You can find his website and blog directly there. He is a great resource for all things Xamarin, and I believe you can check out his courses there as well. So if you didn't get that directly, if you didn't get a chance to write that down, I'm going to shameless plug to hit him up directly there as well. So Jesse, we are down to the wire. Maybe time for 1 to 2 more questions. Taking a look at these coming in, do you see one that's one of your favorites?
There's a question that says, do we have access to native API for iOS? And the answer to that is yes. You have access to the native API for iOS, for Android, for Windows from within Xamarin.Forms. So if there are things that Xamarin.Forms does not supply for you, you can, in fact, get directly to the native API. And you can do that on a per-platform basis.
Fantastic. Oh, and here actually is a shameless plug for Jesse's website in the center of your screen as well that you can go to learn more, check out his podcast and information from Jesse. So I think with that, I'm going to... Oh, go ahead.
Are you bringing it to a close? Because there's one very important question here from Steve.
Yes.
He says, if Xamarin's a native application, what is Xamarin.Forms? And the answer is, it also produces native applications. Xamarin.Forms applications are indistinguishable from native iOS and Android and Windows applications. And the UI is rendered to the native UI. So although the controls, the views, look vanilla, when you're building them in Xamarin.Forms, what is actually produced is exactly what would be expected on each platform.
Excellent question, Steve. Okay, so Jesse, closing thoughts, closing statements, anything you'd like to share with all the attendees?
Well, I'm very appreciative of everybody showing up, and please find everybody you know and tell them to watch the Xamarin.Forms Pluralsight course, and watch it 2, 3, 4 times. It's very, very important that you keep watching it. I'm just joking, because the more you watch it, the better it is. In all seriousness, thank you for taking the time. I had a really good time putting this together.
Awesome. Well, we really enjoyed having you present with us, and we hope to have you back on our program soon. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out today to watch. Again, it was recorded, We'll share the recording with everyone, and we hope to see you all at Pluralsight Live. So with that, I'm going to close out and hope everyone has a wonderful day.